Such a soft, sweet voice it had. I wish I knew, thought poor Alice. She answered rather sadly. Nothing just now. Think again, it said. That won't do, Alice thought, but nothing came of it. Please, would you tell me what you call yourself? She said timidly. I think that might help a little. I'll tell you, if you'll come a little further on, the fawn said. I can't remember here. So they walked on together through the wood, Alice with her arms clasped lovingly round the soft neck of the fawn, till they came out into another open field, and here the fawn gave a sudden bound into the air and shook itself free from Alice's arms. I'm a fawn, it cried out in a voice of delight. And dear me, you're a human child. A sudden look of alarm came into its beautiful brown eyes, and in another moment it had darted away at full speed. Alice stood looking after it, almost ready to cry with vexation at having lost her dear little fellow traveler so suddenly. However, I knew my name now, she said. That's some comfort. Alice, Alice. I won't forget it now. And now, which of these finger posts ought to I follow, I wonder? It was not a very difficult question to ask, as there was only one road through the wood, and the two finger posts both pointed along it. I'll settle it, Alice said to herself, when the road divides and they point different ways. But this did not seem likely to happen. She went on and on a long time, but wherever the road divided there were sure to be two finger posts pointed the same way, one marked to Tweedledum's house, the other marked to the house of Tweedledee. I do believe, said Alice at last, that they live in the same house. I wonder I never thought of that before, but I can't stay here long. I'll just call out and say, hey, how do you do? And ask them how do they the way out of the wood. If I could only get the 8th square before it gets dark. So she wandered on, talking to herself as she went, till on turning a sharp corner, she came upon two fat little men, so suddenly that she could not help starting back, and in another moment she recovered herself, feeling sure that she must be. Chapter 4. Tweedledum and Tweedledee. They were standing under a rock, under a tree, each with an arm around the other's neck, and Alice knew which was which in a moment because one of them had Dum embroidered on his collar, and the other had Dee. I suppose you've got Tweedle on the back of the collar, she said to herself. They stood so still that she quite forgot herself that they were alive, and she was just looking round to see if the word Tweedle was written on the back of each collar, when she was startled by a voice coming from the one marked Dum. If you think we're waxworks, he said, you ought to pay, you know. Waxworks weren't made to be looked at for nothing. No how. Contrariwise, added the one with D, if you think we're alive, you ought to speak. I'm sure I'm very sorry, was all Alice could say, for the words of the old song kept ringing through her head like the ticking of a clock, and she could hardly help saying them out loud. Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedledum and Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew on a monstrous crow, as black as tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so they quite forgot their quarrel. I know what you're thinking about, said Tweedledum, but it isn't so nohow. Contrariwise, continued Tweedledee, if it was so, it might be, and if it were so, it would be, but as it isn't, it ain't. That's logic. I was thinking, Alice said very politely, which is the best way out of this wood? It's getting so dark. Would you please tell me? But the fat little man only looked at each other and grinned. They looked so exactly like a couple of great schoolboys that Alice couldn't help pointing her finger at Tweedledum and saying, First boy, nohow, Tweedledum cried out briskly and shut his mouth up again with a snap. Next boy, said Alice, passing on to Tweedledee, though she felt quite certain that he would only shout out contrariwise, and so he did. You've begun wrong, cried Tweedledum. The first thing in a visit is to say, how do you do, and shake hands. And here the two brothers gave each other a hug, and then they held out the two hands they were free to shake hands with her. Alice did not like shaking hands with either of them first, for fear of hurting the other one's feelings, so as the best way of the difficulty she took hold of both hands at once. The next moment they were dancing round in a ring. This seemed quite natural, she remembered afterwards, and she went on, even surprised to hear music playing. It seemed to come from the tree under which they were dancing, and it was done as well as she could make out by the branches rubbing one across the other like fiddles and fiddlesticks. But it certainly was funny, Alice said afterwards, when she was telling her sister the history of all this, to find myself singing Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. I don't know where I began it, but somehow I felt as if I'd been singing it a long, long time. The other two dancers were fat and very soon out of breath. 4 times round is enough for one dance, Tweedledum panted out, and they left off dancing as suddenly as they had begun. The music stopped at the same moment. Then they let go of Alice's hands and stood looking at her for a minute. There was a rather awkward pause, as Alice didn't know how to begin a conversation with people she had just begun dancing with. It would never do to say, "How do you do?" now, she said to herself. House seemed to have gotten beyond that, somehow. "I hope you're not very much tired," she said at last. "No, How, and thank you very much for asking," said Tweedledum. "So much obliged," added Tweedledee. "You like poetry?" "Yes, pretty well, some poetry," Alice said doubtfully. "Would you tell me which roads lead out of the wood?" "What shall I repeat to her?" said Tweedledee, looking at Tweedledum with great solemn eyes and not noticing Alice's question. "The Walrus and the Carpenter's is the longest," Tweedledum replied, giving his brother an affectionate hug. Tweedledee began instantly. The sun was shining. Here Alice ventured to interrupt him. "If it's very long," she said as politely as she could, "would you please tell me the first road?" Which Tweedledee smiled gently and began, "The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all its might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright. That this odd, because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him," she said, "to come out and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be. The sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud, but because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. The Walrus and the Carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it up for half a year, do you suppose, the Walrus said, that they could get it clear? "I doubt it," said the Carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. "Oh, oysters, come and walk with us." The Walrus did beseech. "A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk, along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than flour, to give a hand to each." The elder oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster's bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat, and this was odd. Because, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast as they could last, and more, and all hopping with the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The Walrus and the Carpenter walked in a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low, and all the little while oysters stood and waited in a row. "The time has come," the Walrus said, "to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit," the oyster cried, "before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath and all of us are fat." "No, hurry," said the Carpenter. They thanked him much for that. "A loaf of bread," the Walrus said, "is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar, besides, are very good indeed. Now, if you are ready, oysters dear, we can begin again to feed, but not on us," the oysters cried, turning a little blue. "After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do." "The next is fine," the Walrus said. "Do you admire the view?" "It was so kind of you to come, and you are very nice." The Carpenter said nothing, but cut us another slice. "I wish you were not quite so deaf. I'd have to ask you twice." "It seems a shame," the Walrus said, "to play them such a trick, after we brought them out so far and made them trot so quick." The Carpenter said nothing, but the butter spread too thick. "I weep for you," the Walrus said. "I deeply sympathize with sobs and tears." He sorted out those sort of largest sighs, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. "Oh, oysters," said the Carpenter, "you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again?" But answer came there none, and this was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten every one. "I like the Walrus best," said Alice, "because, you see, he was a little sorry for the poor oysters." "He ate more than the Carpenter, though," said Tweedledee. "You see, he held his handkerchief in front so that the Carpenter couldn't count how many he took, contrariwise." "That was mean," Alice said indignantly. "Then I like the Carpenter best, if he didn't eat so many oysters as the Walrus." "But he ate as many as he could get," said Tweedledum. This was a puzzler. After a pause, Alice began, "Well, they were both very unpleasant characters. Here she checked herself in some alarm at hearing something that sounded to her like the puffing of a large steam engine in the wood near them, though she feared it was more likely to be a wild beast. "Are there any lions or tigers around here?" she asked timidly. "It's only the Red King snoring," said Tweedledee. "Come and look at him," the brothers cried, and they each took one of the Alice's hands and led her up to where the king was sleeping. "Isn't it a lovely sight?" said Tweedledum. Alice couldn't say what honestly that he was. He had a tall red nightcap on with a tassel, and he was lying crumpled up into a sort of untidy heap and snoring out loud, fit to snore his head off, as Tweedledum remarked. "I'm afraid he'll catch cold with lying on the damp grass," said Alice, who was a very thoughtful little girl. "He's dreaming now," said Tweedledum, "and what do you think he's dreaming about?" Alice said nobody can guess that. "Why, what about you?" Tweedledum exclaimed, clapping his hands triumphantly. "And if he had left dreaming about you, where do you suppose you'd be?" "Where am I now, of course," said Alice. "Not you," Tweedledee retorted contemptuously. "You'd be nowhere. Why, you're only a sort of a thing in his dream." "If that there king was to wake," added Tweedledum, "you'd go out, bang, just like a candle." "I shouldn't," Alice exclaimed indignantly. "Besides, if I'm only a sort of thing in his dream, what are you, I should like to know?" "Ditto," said Tweedledum. "Ditto, ditto," cried Tweedledee.
Attention in the airport. The airport vicinity is under a severe thunderstorm warning. This warning is in effect until 3:45. You can expect 60-mile-per-hour gusts.
He shouted. This was so loud that Alice couldn't help saying, "Hush! You'll be waking him."
All airline managers and terminal tenants are requested to activate their emergency weather plan at this time.
"I'm afraid if you make so much noise."
To stay away from doors and windows. If necessary, proceed to interior center walls or designated...
"Well, it's no use your talking about waking him," said Tweedledum, "when you're the only one of the things in his dream. You know very well you're not real." "I am real," said Alice, and began to cry. "You won't make yourself a bit realer by crying," Tweedledee remarked. "There's nothing to cry about." If I wasn't real," Alice said, half laughing through her tears. It all seemed so ridiculous. "I shouldn't be able to cry." "I hope you don't suppose those are real tears," Tweedledum interrupted in a tone of great contempt. "I know you're talking nonsense," Alice thought to herself, "and it's foolish to cry about it." So she brushed away her tears and went on as cheerfully as she could. "At any rate, I'd be better by getting out of the woods, for it's really coming on very dark. Do you think it's going to rain?" Tweedledum spread a large umbrella over himself and his brother and looked up into it. "No, I don't think it is," he said, "at least not under here, nohow." "But it may rain outside?" "It may if it chooses," said Tweedledee. "We've no objection, contrariwise." Selfish things, thought Alice, and she was just going to say good night and leave them when Tweedledum sprang out from under her umbrella and seized her by the wrist. "Do you see that?" she said in a voice choking with passion, and his eyes large and yellow in a moment, as he pointed with a trembling finger at a small white thing lying under the tree. "It's only a rattle," Alice said, after a careful examination of this little white thing. "Not a rattlesnake, you know," she added hastily, thinking that he was frightened. "Only an old rattle, quite old and broken." "I knew it was," cried Tweedledum, beginning to stamp out wildly and tear his hair. "It's spoiled, of course." Here he looked at Tweedledee, who immediately sat down on the ground and tried to hide himself under the umbrella. Alice laid her hand upon his arm and said in a soothing tone, "You needn't be so angry about an old rattle." "But it isn't old," Tweedledum cried in a greater fury than ever. "It's new, I tell you. I bought it yesterday, my nice new rattle," and his voice rose to a perfect scream. All this time, Tweedledee was trying his best to fold his umbrella with himself in it, which was such an extraordinary thing to do that it quite took off Alice's attention from the angry brother. But he couldn't quite succeed, and it ended in his rolling over, bundled up in the umbrella, but was only head out, and there he lay, opening and shutting his mouth and his large eyes, looking more like a fish than anything else, Alice thought. "Of course, you agree to have a battle?" Tweedledum asked in a calmer tone. "I suppose so," the other sulkily replied as he crawled out of the umbrella. "Only she must help us to dress up, you know." So the two brothers went off hand in hand in the wood and returned in a minute with their arms full of things such as bolsters, blankets, hearthrugs, tablecloths, dish covers, and coal scuttles. "I hope you're a good hand at pinning and tying strings," Tweedledum remarked. "Every one of these things has to go on somehow or the other." Alice said afterwards she had never seen such a fuss made about anything in all her life, the way these two bustled about and the quantity of things they put on, and the trouble they gave her in tying strings and fastening buttons. Really, they'll be more like bundles of old clothes than anything else by the time they're ready, she said to herself as she arranged a bolster around the neck of Tweedledee to keep his head from being cut off, as she said. You know, he added very gravely, it's one of the most serious things that can possibly happen to you once in a battle, to get one's head cut off. Alice laughed loudly, but she managed to turn it into a cough for fear of hurting his feelings. Do I look very pale? Said Tweedledum, coming up to him, his helmet tied on. He called in a helmet, though it certainly looked more like a saucepan. Well, yes, a little, Alice replied gently. I'm very brave, generally, he went on in a low voice, only today I happen to have a headache. And I've got a toothache, said Tweedledee, who had overheard the remark. I'm far worse than you. Then you'd better not fight today, said Alice, thinking it a good opportunity to make peace. We must have a bit of a fight, but I don't care about going on long, said Tweedledum. What's the time now? Tweedledee looked at his watch and said, 4:30. Let's fight till 6 and then have some dinner, said Tweedledum. Very well, the other said rather sadly, and she can watch us, only you'd better not come very close, he added. I generally hit everything I can see when I get really excited. And I hit everything within reach, cried Tweedledum. Well, whether I can see it or not. Alice laughed. You must hit the trees pretty often, I should think, she said. Tweedledum looked round with a satisfied smile. I don't suppose, he said, there will be a tree left standing forever so far around by the time we've finished. And all about a rattle, said Alice, still hoping to make them a little ashamed of fighting for such a trifle. I shouldn't have minded it so much, said Tweedledum, if it hadn't been a new one. I wish the monstrous crow would come, thought Alice. There's only one sword, you know, Tweedledum said to his brother, but you can have the umbrella. It's quite as sharp, only we must begin quick. It's getting as dark as it can. And darker, said Tweedledee. It was getting dark so suddenly that Alice thought there must be a thunderstorm coming on. What a thick black cloud that is, she said, and how fast it comes. Why, I do believe it's got wings. It's the crow, Tweedledum cried out in a shrill voice of alarm, and the two brothers took their heels and
Attention in the airport. The airport vicinity is under
were out of sight in a moment.
thunderstorm warning.
Alice ran a little way to the wood and stopped under a large tree. It can never get me here, he thought. It's far too large to squeeze itself in among the trees, but I wish it wouldn't flap its wings so. It makes me quite a hurricane in the wood. Here's somebody's shawl being blown away. Chapter 5. Wool and Water. She caught the shawl as she spoke and looked up for the owner. In another moment, the White Queen came running wildly through the wood with both arms stretched out wide as if she were flying, and Alice were civilly meant to meet her with the shawl. I'm very glad I happened to be in the way, Alice said as she helped her put her on her shawl again. The White Queen only looked at her in a helpless, frightened sort of a way, and kept repeating something in a whisper to herself that sounded like bread and butter, and Alice felt that if there was to be any conversation at all, she must manage it herself, so she began rather timidly, Am I addressing the White Queen? Well, yes, if you call that addressing, the Queen said, if it isn't my notion of the thing at all. Alice thought it would never do to have an argument at the very beginning of their conversation, so she smiled and said, If your Majesty will only tell me the right way to begin, I'll do it as well as I can. But I don't want it to be done at all, groaned the poor Queen. I've done addressing myself for the last 2 hours. It would have been all but better, as it seemed to Alice, if she had got someone else to dress her, so she was dreadfully untidy. Every single thing's crooked, Alice said to herself, and she's all over pins. May I put your shawl straight for you? She added aloud. I don't know what's the matter with it, the Queen said in a melancholy voice. It's out of temper, I think. I've pinned it here and I've pinned it there, but there's no pleasing it. It can't go straight, you know, if you pin it all on one side, Alice said as she gently put it right for her. And dear me, what a state your hair is in. The brush has got entangled in it, the Queen said with a sigh, and I lost the comb yesterday. Alice carefully released the brush and did her best to get the hair into order. Come, you look rather better now, she said, after altering most of the pins. But really, you should have a lady's maid. I'm sure I'll take you with pleasure, the Queen said. 2 pence a week and jam every other day. Alice couldn't help laughing as she said, I don't want you to hire me, and I don't care for the jam. It's very good jam, said the Queen. Well, I don't want any today, at any rate. You couldn't have it if you did want it, the Queen said. The rule is jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today. It must come sometime to jam today, Alice objected. No, it can't, said the Queen. It's jam every other day Today isn't any other day, you know." "I don't understand you," said Alice. "It's dreadfully confusing." "That's the effect of living backwards," the Queen said kindly. "It always makes one a little giddy at first." "Living backwards," Alice repeated in a great astonishment. "I'd never heard of such a thing. But there's one great advantage in it. That's one memories works both ways." "I'm sure mine only works one way," Alice remarked. "I can't remember things before they happen." "It's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards," the Queen remarked. "What sort of things do you remember best?" Alice ventured to ask. "Oh, things that happen the next week after that," the Queen replied in a careless tone. "For instance, now," she went on, sticking a large piece of plaster on her finger as she spoke, "there's the King Messenger. He's in prison now being punished. The trial doesn't begin until next week, Wednesday, and of course the crime comes last of all." "Suppose he can never commits the crime," said Alice. "What would be better, wouldn't it?" the Queen said as she bound the plaster round her finger with a bit of ribbon. Alice felt that there was no denying that, of course, it would all be better, she said, but it wouldn't be all the better, his being punished. "You're wrong there." "At any rate," said the Queen. "Were you ever punished?" "Only for my faults," said Alice. "And you were all the better for it, I know," the Queen said triumphantly. "Yes, but then I had done the things I was punished for," said Alice. "That makes all the difference." "But if you hadn't done them," the Queen said, "that would have been better still, better and better and better." Her voice went higher with each better till it got quite to a squeak at last. Alice was just beginning to say, "There's a mistake somewhere," when the Queen began screaming so loud that she had to leave the sentence unfinished. Shouted the Queen, shaking her hand as if she wanted to shake it off. "My finger's bleeding, oh." Her screams were so exactly like the whistle of a steam engine that Alice had to hold both hands over her ears. "What is the matter?" she said as soon as there was a chance of making herself heard. "Have you pricked your finger?" "I haven't pricked it yet," the Queen said, "but I soon shall." Oh. "When do you expect to do it?" Alice asked, feeling very much inclined to laugh. "When I fasten my shawl again," the Queen groaned out. "The brooch will come undone directly." Oh. As the brooch flew open, the Queen clutched wildly at it and tried to clasp it again. "Take care," cried Alice. "You're holding it a little crooked." And she caught at the brooch, but it was too late. The pin had slipped, and the Queen had pricked her finger. "That accounts for the bleeding, you see," she said to Alice with a smile. "Now you understand the way things happen here." "But why don't you scream now?" Alice asked, holding her hands ready to put over her ears again. "Why, I've done all the screaming already," said the Queen. "What would be the good of having it all over again?" By this time it was getting late. "The crow must have flown away, I think," said Alice. "I'm so glad it's gone. I thought it was the night coming on." "I wish I could manage to be glad," the Queen said, "only I never can remember the rule." "You must be very happy living in this wood and being glad whenever you like." "Oh, only it's so very lonely here," Alice said in a melancholy voice. At the thought of the loneliness, 2 large tears came rolling down her cheeks. "Oh, don't go on like that," cried the poor Queen, wringing her hands in despair. "Consider what a great girl you are. Consider what a long way you've come today. Consider what a clock it is. Consider anything, only don't cry." Alice could not help laughing at this, even in the midst of tears. "Can you keep from crying by considering things?" she asked. "That's the way it's done," the Queen said with a great decision. "Nobody can do 2 things at once, you know. Let's consider your age. To begin with, how old are you?" "I'm 7½ exactly." "You needn't say exactly," the Queen remarked. I can believe it without that. Now, I'll tell you something to believe. I'm just 101, 5 months and a day." "I can't believe that," said Alice. "Can't you?" the Queen said in a pitying tone. "Try again. Draw a long breath and shut your eyes." Alice laughed. "There's no use trying," she said. "One can't believe impossible things." "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I've believed as much as 6 impossible things before breakfast." There goes the shawl again. The brooch had come undone as she spoke, and a gust of wind blew the Queen's shawl across a little brook. The Queen spread out her arms again and went flying after it, and this time she succeeded in catching it for herself. "I've got it," she cried in a triumphant tone. "Now you shall see me pin it in again all by myself." "Then I hope your finger is better now," Alice said very politely as she crossed the little brook after the Queen. "Oh, much better," said the Queen, her voice rising in a squeak as she went on. "Much better. Better. The last word ended in a long bleat, so like a sheep that Alice quite started. She looked at the queen, who seemed to have suddenly wrapped herself up in wool. Alice rubbed her eyes and looked again. She couldn't make out what had happened at all. Was she in a shop? Was it really a sheep that was sitting on the outside of the counter? Rub as she could make nothing more of it. She was in a little dark shop, leaning with her elbows on the counter, and opposite to her was an old sheep, sitting in an armchair, knitting, and every now and then leaving off to look at her, though, a great pair of spectacles. "What is it you want to buy?" the sheep said at last, looking up for a moment from her knitting. "I don't quite know yet," Alice said gently. "I should like to look around first, if I might." "You may look in front of you on both sides if you like," said the sheep, "but you can't look all around you, unless you've got eyes in the back of your head." But these, as it happened, Alice had not got, so she contented herself with a turning around, looking at the shelves as she came to them. The shop seemed to be full of all manner of curious things, but the oddest part of it all was that whenever she looked hard at any shelf to make out exactly what it had on, that particular shelf was always quite empty, though the others round it were crowded as full as they could hold. "Things flow about so here," she said at last in a plaintive tone, after she had spent a minute or two in vainly pursuing a large bright thing that looked sometimes like a doll and sometimes like a work-box, and was always in the shelf next above the one she was always looking at, and this one was the most provoking of all. "But I'll tell you what," she added, as a sudden thought struck her, "I'll follow it up to the very top shelf of all. It'll puzzle it to go through the ceiling, I expect." But even this plan failed. The thing went through the ceiling as quietly as possible, as if it were quite used to it. "Are you a child or a totem?" the sheep said, as she took up another pair of needles. "You'll make me a giddy soon if you go on turning round like that." She was now working with 14 pairs at once, and Alice couldn't help looking at her in great astonishment. "How can she knit with so many?" the puzzled child said to herself. "She gets more and more like a porcupine every minute." "Can you row?" the sheep asked, handing her a pair of knitting needles as she spoke. "Yes, a little, but not on land, and not with needles," Alice was beginning to say, when suddenly the needles turned into oars in her hands, and she found they were in a little boat, gliding along between banks, so there was nothing for it but to do her best. "Feather!" cried the sheep, as she took up another pair of needles. This didn't sound like a remark that needed any answer, so Alice said nothing, but pulled away. There was something very queer about the water, she thought, so every now and then when the oars got fast in it, she would hardly come out again. "Feather, Feather!" the sheep cried out again, taking more needles. "You'll be catching a crab directly." "A dear little crab?" thought Alice. "I should like that." Didn't you hear me say feather?" the sheep cried angrily, taking up quite a bunch of needles. "Indeed I did," said Alice. "You've said it very often and very loud. Please, where are the crabs?" "In the water, of course," said the sheep, sticking up some of the needles in her hair, as her hands were full. "Feather, I say. Why do you say feather so often?" Alice asked at last, rather vexed. "I'm not a bird." "You are," said the sheep. "You're a little goose." This offended Alice a little. So there was no more conversation for a minute or two, while the boat glided gently on, sometimes among beds of weeds, which made the oars stick fast in the water worse than ever, and sometimes under trees, which always had the same tall river banks frowning over their heads. "Oh, please, there are scented rushes," Alice cried in a sudden transport of delight. "There really are, and such beauties." "You needn't say please to me about 'em," the sheep said without looking up from her knitting. "I didn't put 'em there, and I'm not going to take 'em away." "No, but I meant, please, maybe wait and pick some up," Alice pleaded. "If you don't mind stopping the boat for a minute." "How am I to stop it?" said the sheep. "If you leave off rowing, it'll stop for itself." So the boat was left to drift down the stream as it would till it glided gently in among the waving rushes, and then the little sleeves were carefully rolled up, and the little arms were plunged in elbow deep to get hold of the rushes a good long way down before breaking them off, and for a while Alice forgot all about the sheep and the knitting, and as soon as she bent over the side of the boat with just the ends of her tangled hair dipping into the water, while with bright, eager eyes she caught at one bunch after another of the darling scented rushes. "I only hope the boat won't topple over," she said to herself. "Oh, what a lovely one, only I couldn't quite reach it." And it certainly did seem a little provoking, almost as if it had happened on purpose, she thought, that though she managed to pick plenty of beautiful rushes as the boat glided by, there was always a more lovely one that she couldn't reach. "The prettiest are always the furthest," she said at last, with a sigh of obstinacy of the rushes in growing so far off, as with flushed cheeks and dripping hair and hands, she scrambled back into her place and began to arrange her new-found treasures. What mattered it to her just then that the rushes had begun to fade and to lose all their scent and beauty, from the very moment that she picked them? Even real scented rushes, you know, last only a very little while, and these, being dream rushes, melted away almost like snow as they lay in heaps at her feet. But Alice hardly noticed this. There were so many other curious things to think about. They hadn't gone much farther before the blade of one of the oars got fast in the water and wouldn't come out again, so Alice explained it afterwards, and the consequence was that the handle of it caught under her chin, and in spite of a series of little shrieks of "oh, oh, oh" from poor little Alice, it swept her straight off the seat and down among the heap of rushes. However, she wasn't a bit hurt, and was soon up again, and the sheep went on with her knitting all the while, just as if nothing had happened. "That was a nice crab you caught," she remarked as Alice got it back into her place, very much relieved to find herself still in the boat. "Was it?" "I don't see it," said Alice, peeping cautiously over the side of the boat into the dark water. "I wish it hadn't let go. I should so like a little crab to take home with me," said the sheep, only laughed scornfully and went on with her knitting. "Are there any crabs here?" said Alice. "Crabs and all sorts of things," said the sheep. "Plenty of choices, only make up your mind. Now, what do you want to buy?" "To buy?" Alice echoed in a tone that was half astonished and half frightened, for the oars and the boat and the river had vanished all in a moment, and she was back again in a little dark shop. "I would like to buy an egg, please," she said timidly. "How do you sell them?" "5 farthing for one, 2 for two," the sheep replied. "Then 2 are cheaper than 1?" Alice said in a surprised tone, taking out her purse. "Only you must eat them both if you buy 2, said the sheep. "Then I'll have 1, please," said Alice, as she put the money down on the counter, for she thought to herself, "They mightn't be all that nice, you know." The sheep took the money and put it away in a box. Then she said, "I never put things into people's hands that would never do. You must get it for yourself." And so saying, she went off the other end of the shop and set the egg upright on a shelf. "I wonder why it wouldn't do," thought Alice as she groped her way among the tables and chairs, for the shop was very dark towards the end. "The egg seems to be further away than the more I walk towards it. Let me see, is this a chair? Why, it's got branches, I declare. How very odd to find trees growing here. And actually, here's a little brook. Well, this is the very queerest shop I ever saw." So she went on, wondering more and more at every step, as everything turned into a tree the moment she came up to it, and she quite expected the egg to do the same. Chapter 5. Humpty Dumpty. However, the egg only got larger and larger and more human. When she had come up with a few yards of it, she saw that it was eyes and nose and mouth, and when she came up to it very close, she clearly saw that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. "It can't be anybody else," she said to herself. "I'm certain of it, as my name is written all over his face. It might have been written 100 times easily on that enormous face." Humpty Dumpty was sitting with his legs crossed on the top of the high wall, such a narrow one that Alice quite wondered how he could keep his balance, and as his eyes were steadily fixed in the opposite direction, and he didn't take the least notice of her, she thought he must be stuffed figure after all. "And how exactly like an egg he is," she said aloud, standing with her hands ready to catch him, for she was very moment expecting him to fall. "It's very provoking," Humpty Dumpty said after a long silence, looking away from Alice as he spoke, "to be called an egg. Very." "I said you looked like an egg, sir," Alice gently explained, "and some eggs are very pretty, you know," she said, hoping to turn her remark into a sort of compliment. "Some people," said Humpty Dumpty, looking away from her as usual, "have no more sense than a baby." Alice didn't know what to say to this. It wasn't at all like conversation, she thought, as she had never had anything to her. In fact, his last remark was evidently addressed to a tree. So she stood and softly repeated to herself, "Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty in his place again." "The last line is much too long for the poetry," she added, almost too loud, forgetting that Humpty Dumpty would hear her. "Don't Don't stand chattering to yourself like that, Humpty Dumpty said, looking at her for the first time. But tell me your name and your business. My name is Alice, but it's a stupid name enough, Humpty Dumpty interrupted impatiently. What does it mean? Must a name mean something? Alice asked doubtfully. Of course it must, Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh. My name means the shape I am. A good, handsome shape it is, too. With a name like yours, you may be any shape almost. Why do you sit out here all alone? Said Alice, not wishing to begin an argument. Why, because there's nobody with me. Cried Humpty Dumpty. Did you think that I didn't know the answer to that? Asked another. Don't you think you'd be safer down on the ground? Alice went on, not with any idea of another riddle, but simply in her good-natured anxiety for the queer creature. That wall is so very narrow. What tremendously easy riddles you ask, Humpty Dumpty growled out. Of course I don't think so. Why, if I ever did fall off, which there's no chance of, but if I did... Here he pursed up his lips and looked so solemn and grand that Alice could hardly help laughing. If I did fall, he went on, the king has promised me... You may turn pale if you like. You didn't think that I was going to say, did you? The king has promised me with his very own mouth to send all his horses and all his men, Alice interrupted rather unwisely. Now I declare that's too bad, Humpty Dumpty cried, breaking into a sudden passion. You've been listening at doors and behind trees and down chimneys, or you couldn't have known it. I haven't indeed, Alice said very gently. It's in a book. Oh, well, they may write such things in a book, Humpty Dumpty said in a calmer tone. That's what you call a history of England, that is. Now, take a good look at me. I'm the one who has spoken to the king. I am. Mayhap you'll never see such another. To show you that I'm not too proud, you may shake hands with me. And he grinned almost from ear to ear as he leaned forwards and as nearly as possible fell off the wall in doing so, and offered Alice his hand. She watched him a little anxiously as she took it. If he smiled much more, the ends of his mouth might meet behind, she thought, and then I don't know what would happen to his head. I'm afraid it would come off. Yes, all his horses and all his men, Humpty Dumpty went on. They'd pick me up again in a minute. They would. However, this conversation is going on a little too fast. Let's go back to the last remark one. I'm afraid I can't quite remember it, Alice said politely. In that case, we start fresh, said Humpty Dumpty, and it's my turn to choose a subject. He talks about it just as if it was a game, thought Alice. So here's a question for you. How old did you say you were? Alice made a short calculation and said 7 years and 6 months. Wrong, Humpty Dumpty exclaimed triumphantly. You never said a word like it. I thought you meant how old are you, Alice explained. If I'd meant that, I'd have said it, said Humpty Dumpty. Alice didn't want to begin another argument, so she said nothing. 7 years and 6 months, Humpty Dumpty repeated thoughtfully, an uncomfortable sort of age. Now, if you'd asked my advice, I'd have said, leave off at 7. But it's too late now. I never ask advice about growing, Alice said indignantly. Too proud? The other inquired. Alice felt more indignant at his suggestion. I mean, she said, that one can't help growing older. One can't, perhaps, said Humpty Dumpty, but two can. With proper assistance, you might have left off at 7. What a beautiful belt you've got on, Alice said suddenly. They had had quite enough of the subject of age, she thought, and if they really were to take turns in choosing subjects, it was her turn now. At least she corrected herself on second thoughts. A beautiful cravat, I should have said. No, a belt, I beg your pardon. She added in dismay, for Humpty Dumpty looked thoroughly offended, and she began to wish she hadn't chosen the subject. If only I knew, she thought to herself, which was the neck and which was the waist. Evidently Humpty Dumpty was very angry, though he had said nothing for a minute or two. When he did speak again, it was in a deep growl. It was a most provoking thing, he said at last, when a person who doesn't know a cravat from a belt. I know it's a very ignorant of me, Alice said in a humble tone that Humpty Dumpty relented. It's a cravat, child, and a beautiful one, and as you say, it's a present from the White King and Queen. Where now? Is it really? Said Alice, quite pleased to find that she had chosen a good subject after all. They gave it to me, Humpty Dumpty continued thoughtfully as he crossed one knee over the other and clasped his hands round it. They gave it to me for an unbirthday present. I beg your pardon, Alice said in a puzzled air. I'm not offended, said Humpty Dumpty. I mean, what is an unbirthday present? A present given when it isn't your birthday, of course. Alice considered a little. I like birthday presents best, she said at last. You don't know what you're talking about, cried Humpty Dumpty. How many days are there in a year? 365, Alice said. And how many birthdays have you? One? And if you take 1 from 365, what remains? 364, of course. Humpty Dumpty looked doubtful. I'd rather see that done on paper, he said. Alice couldn't help smiling as she took out her memorandum book and worked the sum for him. Humpty Dumpty took the book and looked at it carefully. That seems to be done right, he began. You're holding it upside down, Alice interrupted. To be sure I was, Humpty Dumpty said gaily as she turned round for him. I thought it looked a little queer. As I was saying, that seems to be done right, though I haven't time to look it over thoroughly just now. And that shows that there are 364 days when you might get on birthday presents. Certainly, said Alice, and only one for birthday presents, you know? There's glory for you. I don't know what you mean by glory, Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant, there's a nice knockdown moment for you. But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument, Alice objected. When I use a word,